Okay, let's make a start. So can I just introduce myself first? My name is Richard Calvert. I'm Deputy Vice Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam, and I'll be leading us through the session today. It's really good to see so many of you here today. It's a really important day. It's a day we've been waiting for, certainly as the team that have been developing the National Civic Impact Accelerator. And I hope this is going to be a really interesting and engaging session. And indeed that the work of the NCIA is going to be really engaging within the sector and beyond. Let me just do the usual little bit of logistics before we kick off. We are recording this session and it'll be made available after the event. I think as you'll have seen, we're automatically switching off microphones and cameras, but we will take questions and answers, but we'll ask you to use the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen when we get onto the Q&A segment. We're going to start with probably about half an hour or so of presentations, and then we'll move into Q&A. And please also, just if you have any technical issues, feel free to just drop those into the chat function and someone in the team will help you. I'm just going to say a few things before we get going, and I hand over to colleagues who are going to take us through the work of the NCIA in a bit more detail. I guess I was going to say a little bit about why we're here today, why NCIA, a little bit about what, and a little bit about what next. So first of all, why? I mean, I guess most of us are here today because one way or another, we're pretty much bought into the idea that universities have a critical role to play in relation to place. Of course, that's not in any way a new idea, but I think it is one which has been much debated and come into much sharper focus over the last few years. Partly that's about the politics, levelling up, inequalities, whatever, plenty of ways into the politics on this, but the politics on this are undoubtedly much sharper. But I am also just going to go also back to the work of the Civic University Commission back in 2019, which acknowledged the work that many universities had done on the civic and place agenda, but also challenged them in terms of ways in which they could improve their focus and impact. And of course, that led on to the establishment of the Civic University Network. I'm sure many of you on this call are members of the Civic University Network and have attended events. And I think we've seen through the CUN and also through all the work which has been done on civic university agreements over the last 3 or 4 years, very many success stories and very many areas where the sector has really advanced its practice. But I think it's probably also fair to say that as we've gone through that, we've also exposed some of the areas where there's still much more work to do. And I think we've exposed particularly the fact that for many of us, our understanding of what really works in this space is not as good as it needs to be. We've exposed that very often in our institutions there are gaps in capability. There's often gaps or muddle around leadership of this agenda. We've not always been as good as we should be about sharing innovation. And also critically, I think not always as good as we should be about really testing ourselves on assessing and measuring impact. And in many ways, that's where the idea of the NCIA was formed, out of that first couple of years of experience of the CUN. I should say, and I think you saw on the slide that was up just a few minutes ago, the NCIA is very much a team effort. It is hosted here at Sheffield Hallam, but we have university partners, Birmingham, Queen Mary, Newcastle. We've also got partners from the Institute of Community Studies at the Young Foundation, National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, the OECD, and of course underpinned with support and funding from UKRI. And that team approach, I hope you will see very much as we go through this session and indeed through the work of the next few years. My colleagues are going to say much more about what the NCIA is going to do. We're going to go through the different work streams, but fundamentally it's designed to help the sector to understand better what works, how we can best translate that into high quality interventions, how we can develop stronger local leadership and capacity, and critically how we can enable better measurement and assessment of impact. And we want to do this all in a way which is really engaging. It's not about us saying what the answers are. I think it's about us collectively working together to address and answer those questions, and indeed to learn from each other as we go through this. So we're going to go through three main work streams. I'm going to start by handing over to Emily Morrison, Director of the Institute of Community Studies, and Emily and Ed Ferrari. Ed is Director of the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research here at Hallam. Emily and Ed are going to lead us on the first work stream. Then going to hand over to Sophie Duncan. Sophie is co-director at the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, and Sophie, together with Paul Manners, who I'm sure many of you will also know, leading work on the second work stream. And then Greg Burke, who is our Director of Place and Civic Engagement at Hallam, will take us through the third work stream, and hopefully we'll just go on straight through those three presentations that hopefully will give you a good overview of what we're trying to achieve through the NCIA, and then we'll open it up for questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over straight away to Emily.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to reach this point where we're launching the NCIA. I'm here to talk to you about work stream 1. A crucial part of what the NCIA is there to do is to really build out the evidence base around what works in terms of universities' civic practice. And I think central to that, there's 3 objectives, if we just move to the next slide. We want to create a shared understanding and knowledge base on the impact of universities in the UK, specifically in terms of civic working. And I know a lot of you will already understand what that means, but it's particularly, we are defining civic as the way that universities work within their place and how they work in partnership to the shared benefit of that place. And that's through working with other anchor institutions, diversity of local stakeholders, including, for example, local government, the NHS, local businesses, the voluntary and community sector, and with residents and community networks and groups themselves. And what we're really looking to do through the first work stream is actually distill the evidence that already exists into a position where we can actually feel confident in directing people to what works and where there is evidence of the outcomes that that produces from civic practice in place. And then we're also wanting to support how to translate that knowledge into practical action. So we're not just stopping at creating an evidence base, even though one of the central objectives of the NCIA is to really grow that evidence base considerably and make it immediately accessible, provide navigation through it. At the moment, we know it's very siloed, it's very piecemeal. A lot of it is held within different institutions, and we want to bring that together and provide pathfinding through that. But we also want to support how people can translate that into action. I just move to the next slide. So there are 7 domains to the Civic Impact Framework, and those of you that have been working with the Civic University Network since when it was launched a couple of years ago will be more familiar with this. And what we are planning to do with the evidence programme is to look at those 7 domains. They're there on the screen in front of you, and they really represent the 7 key kind of thematic areas by which universities impact on place. This is work that Ed Ferrari led over the course of the last couple of years, and it was distilled by looking at a lot of the practice and the strategies and the plans, but also the evidence base around how universities could impact on place. What we are looking to do through the evidence programme now is really a process where we are mapping the work that is already existing under any of those domains. We are identifying much more targeted research questions under those domains. So obviously they're all quite broad, well-being and the role of universities on impacting on well-being through civic working. That's a huge topic area in and of itself. So we will be distilling down what the particular gaps are in that evidence base, what the particular questions are that we really need to respond to, and then looking at what evidence do we need and how can we learn from that evidence. And so there's a sort of 6-phase process as we unpick each of those domains. If I can just move to the next slide, please. To give you a bit of a flavour of our approach to evidence, we aren't going to just stop at what's published or where there is already existing evaluations, formal or informal, and we're definitely not going to stop just at the knowledge held by universities themselves. We're really interested in terms of how we work under any of the research questions that the NCIA chooses to focus on how partners' experiences, and central to that is all of you, how partners' experiences and local knowledge can feed into our understanding. So we want to make sure that this is completely inclusive of the lived experience of local communities, for example. We want to make sure that it's inclusive of the experience of the other types of anchor institutions that I mentioned at the start and their experience of working with people. And we want to make sure that we're also critically looking at how, for example, the role of each of those institutions varies within successful, sort of evidence on what works. So, what is the role of the NHS, for example, if we're going back to the wellbeing question, and how does that differ to the role of the university, and how can we understand what a really successful partnership would look like that would then, make the most of both of those strengths, basically. So we're taking a very critical and expansive and inclusive approach to evidence creation and to evidence distilling that by no means stops at what has been evaluated so far, because if we did stop there, it would be a lot more limited. I just move to the next slide, please. So how will we work? So these are, again, very top level, but particularly gives you an idea of the overall programme. And the main objective over the course of the next 3 years is develop a civic intelligence hub. Now, this will be both, an online digital space where you can access all of the evidence. This is not just for universities and members of the Civic University Network, it's for all types of anchor institution and people working within place. So that we're hoping this will also have value for everyone from community groups through to local government and those other policy makers seeking to have an impact on place. But how we're going to build that civic intelligence hub, we'll be doing an initial evidence review, really to identify gaps in particular, but also areas where we feel confident that there is strong civic practice already happening. We'll be working through evidence commissioning. So we have 6 expert panels that mean that we're not just, sort of talking to ourselves about what the evidence base is. Those 6 panels encompass expert commissioners from across both academia, but also those working at the coalface of this kind of place-based civic working. And they will be directing us alongside a needs analysis, which we're looking to do with lots of you on this call, around where do we particularly need to focus our efforts, where are there evidence gaps. And then we will be assembling that evidence in ways that are accessible and also inclusive, and that will include thematic case studies that link to the different domains. We will have regular calls for evidence that we're seeking to make non-burdensome and non-onerous to respond to, and that's also to pick up tacit knowledge, where people can actually present knowledge that might not have been formally evaluated or might not have a kind of written sort of form of it, but how we can pick up and look at where there's emerging practice and radical practice that might actually then deliver really transformative effects. And crucially, we're supporting the Workstrand 2 action learning sets that Paul and Sophie will be talking to, and really kind of informing those learning sets in a way that makes the evidence really practical, basically, because we know that a lot of people want to just do this work better. So we don't want to just create kind of libraries of evidence that won't be used. We want it to be a real hub of iterative evidence production and learning. And finally, we will be developing a theory of civic change for place. I think we won't necessarily have just one, because places are very different. If you're working in a rural community and you're the only university, that is profoundly different to if you are working across a very busy city ecosystem, or indeed, in a sort of market town, for example, where your relationship with the local community and the conditions that community is experiencing are very different. So just moving to the next slide there. So this is just to really give an indication of our engagement with some of you on this call and those of you working in this space through Workstrand 1. So this will be largely channeled through the work of Workstrand 2 and Workstrand 3, where there are, the learning sets, but also there's a wider programme of workshops, webinars, capacity building and engagement, which I know that Greg, Paul and Sophie will talk you through in a moment. But particularly what we're looking in terms of our engagement with you is we want to understand what knowledge gaps you have. We want to be demand-led in how we work with evidence in the NCIA. We want to understand what usable and useful evidence looks like. You know, are case studies helpful? Is there a more valuable way we can present this and distill it? Can we make, you know, the evidence more live and dynamic in a way that you can use it better and feel confident using it? And we also really want to have an ongoing conversation about the shared challenges that your university and your local places and partnerships have, so we can be demand-led and direct evidence to where it is most needed. So I'll stop there. I'm just going to hand quickly to Ed Ferrari to see if he wants to add anything, but thank you so much for giving me the chance to walk you through the evidence programme today. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And hello, everyone. I just really wanted to add 2 very quick points to what Emily's set out there about what we're trying to achieve with Workstream 1. And the first of that picks up on something that Richard said at the beginning around the challenge of measurement. And I think that's quite a scary thing. I think it's something that as a sector we've not done particularly well in terms of measuring our impact on our places so far, and we shouldn't shy away from that very difficult challenge. But I did want to offer some thoughts or assurance that that's not really about measuring quantities of activity. It's really about measuring our collective and individual progress towards our own self-defined civic ambitions within universities, which will look very different in different places. So it's a complex intellectual challenge around measurement, but one that the NCIA is sort of very much excited about getting into. And the second is about context. We often talk about what works. It's, you know, in the evaluation of what works, that question sort of drives everything in a sense. But it's more than that. It's really about what works for whom, in what ways, and in what contexts. Because again, in the civic space, the civic universities landscape context, I think, is everything, because place is everything, and place are so different. So there was just a few sort of thoughts reflecting on what Emily was saying, and it's my responsibility now, I think, to hand over to Sophie, who's going to talk about Workstream 2.
Thanks, Ed. And so Workstream 2 sits at the heart of, if you like, the experiential part of the NCIA. And we're really interested in creating a dynamic learning and innovation program that institutions can be a part of with their partners in order to accelerate learning and build understanding. And so on this next slide, you'll see that our approach is based on a learning cycle, this experiential learning cycle. I don't know whether that's, yep, thank you. And so we want people to be able to come with their experience. We know that loads of people in the sector are already doing really thoughtful work in these spaces of imagining and reimagining what it means to be civic in different places across England. We want to bring those experiences into this learning community, reflect together on those experiences, and then perhaps come up with new ideas or new ways to approach perhaps some of the challenges that arise out of trying to work in a more civically engaged way. And then as part of that, we'll be having opportunities to experiment with some of those ideas and then come back again to reflect on the experiences that those experiments have led us to. And so around this, on our next slide, you'll see that we're inviting 12 institutions and their partners to join us on this. And we're conceiving this of groups of staff and partners as action teams within these 12 institutions. And what we're hoping is that those 12 institutions will nominate staff and partners to be part of these 8 learning groups. And those 8 learning groups hopefully will provide a really interesting way to reflect on what's possible within progressing civicness within those different institutions. So those learning groups will be convened by us at the NCCPE. Our initial plan is that they're going to be themed by roles, so the roles that people are doing. But over time, we're imagining those groups will be reimagined to be more thematic. And we absolutely want this scaffolded by the Civic Impact Framework. So if you've not taken a chance to look at that yet, we really encourage you to take a look and see if and how it could be helpful to your work. Our plan is that these groups would meet online predominantly, because we appreciate that there will be, from different regions of the UK, and it would probably be happening every other month. And as Emily has already indicated, these learning groups will also be supported by the Expertise and Evidence Hub. The action teams, we hope, would involve HE staff and their partners. And we hope that the idea would be that the learning that are happening within the learning groups would be fed back to support internal change within those institutions. And then over the course of the programme, we'd meet as a cohort 3 times in order to share experiences and also perhaps to reconceive some of those learning groups. So on the next slide, this is a picture that was taken from a systemic action research programme that the NCCPE coordinated quite a number of years ago. I noticed a few of the people who are coming here might even have been a part of that process. And what I wanted to really share was that a lot of us are doing really thoughtful work in our institutions and in our places and with our partners, but actually there can be some really tough challenges and also some opportunities that we're not always clear how to maximise, to realise. And so being part of this learning community is going to be both hard work, but also hopefully really useful in terms of accelerating ideas and thinking and for galvanising change. And it's also hopefully going to be a lot of fun as we explore some of the ways that we can work better in the places to lead to more effective contributions. So on our next slide, why should you take part? So I'm hoping you're sitting there thinking, oh, I might like to take a part in this, and we would really welcome that. It's going to be a chance to join a dynamic learning community working alongside colleagues and their partners from across England. The groups will be facilitated and supported so that those groups will have a lot of help to come together and to share together. They're going to be supported again through the specialist expertise and evidence provided by the Evidence Hub. And we also have secured some innovation funding, and there'll be 2 rounds of innovation funding for groups to bid for that would enable them to support focused experimentation, just to help, I guess, make that possible. And there are also bursaries to support people to participate in the learning groups if it isn't part of their current role. And there'll be an opportunity to develop things that are going to be useful in informing your own practice, but also informing tools and resources for the wider sector. So on the next slide, please, what commitment would you need to make? It is a commitment to take part in this programme, and we would need you to identify a project lead who would be the key point of contact with us at the NCCPE. You need to bring together an internal action team, a team committed to taking action and learning from what's happening within the learning groups. You'd need to be committed to come to those wider meetings. We think that they're going to be a really rich opportunity to build change. So well, I think you'd want to come to them, but we'd like you to commit to coming to those. And we've got room for, you need at least 3 staff or partners to be a part of this, but you can invite up to 9 partners and staff to be a part of it. And you need to be able to support them to participate in those bi-monthly groups. Clearly, you need to commit to action and reflection in between meetings, and meetings are not an end in themselves. They are a starting point for change. And also to help us by contributing to the development of resources and toolkits for the wider sector, for those who weren't involved in that action learning process. On the next slide, this is what we're going to be asking. We're going to very shortly be launching an expression of interest, and we're going to be asking you to share how the commitment of staff resource and the fact that you're able to commit to what the programme requires, the commitment to taking action, and also the identification of specific challenges and opportunities that you'd like to bring into this space, as well as the areas of expertise you're bringing to help colleagues. We're also going to take into account the relative maturity of the partnership's approach to civic engagement, because we think it will be much richer if we have people on different stages of the journey. We also want to look at the characteristics of the place, the geography and demography, and the extent of the existing civic infrastructure. And also we want to look at, balance this group in terms of the scale and mission of the universities involved and their thematic priorities. So what next? The final slide. After today, you'll be able to share your interest in getting involved in the NCIA, and you can say if you'd like to be involved in this programme. We will be launching an official expression of interest on the 18th of April, and we'll be absolutely communicating that to the wider sector through the NCIA. The closing date for applications will be the 30th of May. And then hopefully the week beginning the 10th of July, we'll have our first get together all together to launch that process. So I hope some of you find that a tantalizing prospect, and we'll be going back to your institutions to work out how you can get involved. But I'm going to hand over to Greg, who's going to talk about Workstream 3.
Sophie, thanks very much, and thanks for this opportunity to share with you today this exciting launch of the NCIA. Just to say a little bit about where does Workstream 3 sit in with Workstream 1 and 2, which colleagues have just explained to you. So, as we said at the beginning, really, the whole of NCIA is about boosting effective civic practice. So some of the things that colleagues have talked about is some of the things that we'll be doing to investigate, to gather, to experience together. And then Workstream 3 is about how do we disseminate that, how do we capture it, and how do we make it have the maximum impact. So there will be a whole package of engagement, capacity building and dissemination activities to make sure that as many people as possible are able to benefit from the learning, from the experience, the things that are happening across the network. And we'll have a very clear way of broadcasting the NCIA outputs in a very clear and understandable way, so that as many people as possible are able to adopt and build into their practice the learning from the things that are happening in Workstream 1 and 2. Next slide, please. It is important, I think, with thinking about the NCIA, to make sure that we recognise, and people have already made references a couple of times already today, that this does very much build on what's already happened through the Civic University network. So this is not in any sense starting from scratch, but this is absolutely building on some of the really good things that have happened already, some of the ways in which we've shared and we've learned from one another, and some of the really good practice ideas that have come through the network so far. So we want to build on those effective ways that we've shared, that we've disseminated through the Civic University network, but we want to make it better, bigger, and as Ed was saying, to have much greater impact, so that we really as universities start to see that impact that we can have on our places. Next slide, please. So this is all about, as I say, scaling up. And I want to say a little bit more about the different areas by which we're going to scale up through Workstream 3. So it's about scaling up support, tools, training, communications. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Scaling up support. We will be developing a coordinated programme of support, building on the work that was already been described in the previous presentations. Engaging with the sector and the wider sector audiences in the outputs from Workstream 1 and 2. So Workstream 3 really will be the way in which we bring together the learning, the experience from Workstream 1 and 2, and then we share that so that it can have the maximum effect across the network. And we will be working on this whole space of thought leadership. So developing effective civic practice and then sharing that so that it actually influences and shapes the way things are developed. Next slide, please. We're developing a whole set of tools, and tools are really important. It's been a very strong message that's come through the Civic University network so far. People need tools. Ed's talked about, and Emily, about the framework. People need ways of carrying out the tasks that they're trying to carry out. So this will be a key part of what we develop, what we share, tools that people can actually use to do the work they're trying to do to take forward their civic objectives. Next slide, please. We've identified training as quite a big issue. So for many people in the civic space, they are struggling to necessarily develop the skills and the competencies they need to be effective in the civic space that they're trying to operate. And so part of what we'll be developing through Workstream 3 is this whole area of a framework for developing the competencies, the skills that people operating in the civic space within their institution can engage with, can learn from one another, and can go on that journey of developing their competence and effectiveness together. Next slide, please. So communication is absolutely key and underpins all the other things that we've been talking about. Because if we don't have an effective way of communicating the things that we're learning, the lessons that are useful, the things that we've tried that perhaps have not worked, the things we've tried that have been really effective, we need to get that out into the system. So actually having a very clear sense in which we are going to communicate these things in an effective way so people can understand them and use them will be a very key part of Workstream 3. Next slide. We would very much encourage you to look at, to listen to the podcast, which is an interview with Professor John Goddard, which should be available fairly soon after we close this session today, which is a really good interview where John talks about his experience and is able to share with this whole his thoughts on this whole agenda. I'm now going to pass back to Richard so we can go into the Q&A session.
Great, thanks very much to Paul, to Sophie, and to Emily and Ed. So we'll go into the Q&A now. Thanks very much to all of you who've dropped questions into the Q&A. Quite a lot in there already, more coming in all the time. So let me pick a few out. There's one or two themes, there's one or two specific ones, and we'll try and work our way through as many as we can. We've got until about 22 before we need to start to wrap up. So I'm just going to go up to the top actually, start with the question around the OECD as a partner, and I just wonder if someone would like to say a little bit more about how we're going to join the OECD. Who'd like to pick up that one? Emily, do you want to start?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so we're the OECD is there to help draw in international examples of civic practice and to critically assemble how those are working. That's very much so that we can not just look at the practice in the UK and learn from it, that we can actually bring in inspiring practice and inspiring approaches. And also, I think, challenge ourselves in terms of how international partners in the European Union, but also the US has a very rich history of civic engagement, and also across Australia, for example, has really been leading the charge in this area for a very long time. The OECD is there to draw in examples of that practice and also to challenge us as to some of the paradigms around what impact means, there to give us routes into engaging with international partners. And we hope that will strengthen UK partners and UK universities, what they can get from the NCIA, because we're aiming to be a conduit for this international kind of gateway into a wider civic ecosystem that exists abroad as well as here. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Emily. I'm going to jump on to the next question down, actually, which I think is probably still Workstream 1, but it's about the panels. And can we say a little bit more about who's going to be involved in the panels? What's that going to look like?
Yes, of course, and I can take that and Ed can jump in. So in terms of the panels, we are very much not just relying on academic expertise in this area, although we will be very much looking as well to respect and build on, there's a lot of people that have written and evidenced and critically reviewed sort of civic work, including across many of the different universities in the UK. But we're also going to be, as part of the panels, drawing in representatives, for example, from social investment communities, so people who are working on these really big public-private place partnerships, because that is part of the civic ecosystem increasingly. We will have community representatives as well, so people, for example, leading voluntary and community sector organisations who have a particular, sort of need for evidence in one of those domains from the civic impact framework, then we might be looking at also local government and drawing on their expertise. And really that is to direct to what are the emerging questions, what are the burning issues that people are grappling with in terms of universities' role within places. So the panels are going to be multi-sector. They definitely will not just be academic panels. And that's also to, I think, from a quality assurance perspective, really challenge us as to what is useful, good, robust evidence in this space. Because, I've been a policymaker, I've also been a, community activist in different sectors, and I'm also an academic. I know that very, very different doctrines of what good evidence looks like exist in all of those fields, and we need to bring that into conversation in terms of the evidence around the NCIA so that people actually use it, and it doesn't just sit on shelves, as it were.
Great. Ed, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think Emily covered what I would have said in response to that question.
I will nevertheless, though, I was going to tee you into the next question as well, Ed, so I'll go straight on into that one. And it's a question from John Goddard. What's the difference between evidence of economic impact and the accountability of universities to the local community? I suspect it's one you could talk on at some length, but do you want to just give a kind of quick reaction on that one?
Yeah, I think it's a two-part question, so a very quick two-part answer. Economic impact, I think we're well versed, not just in the university sector, but increasingly across all areas of society, in trying to demonstrate our economic impact. There's lots of tools out there. And I don't think that's really where the NCIA will be sort of majoring most of its time, because as I said, there are lots of tools out there, but there is a critical difference between direct and indirect economic impacts. So I think if universities are quite clear about their direct economic impacts and there are tools to measure those, we need to be thinking much more about those broader indirect impacts. But the accountability question is really interesting. My answer to that, and I hope that this will be sort of a principle that runs through NCIA, certainly will be in work stream 1, which is really to sort of build on the tenets of the Civic University Commission, which encouraged very strongly the sector to develop local civic university agreements. And we know so many of the universities that have been part of the Civic University Network in the last year or two have developed those CUAs or equivalent agreements in their local areas. And the distinctive thing about a CUA and why it's important for accountability is that that's a university and its civic partners in its place coming together to agree what it is that the university is for and how it delivers benefits and impacts on that particular place. And that will differ from university to university and from place to place. And that's why the Civic University Agreement process, I think, is so critical to accountability. That gets us away from thinking that universities are accountable to UK PLC, even though, of course, they have an important role there, and much more into the space of thinking about, well, what does my local authority think of me as a university? What does the NHS locally think of me as a university? What does the local voluntary and community sector think of how easy it is to work with my university? And are we all working together on shared missions?
Great, thanks very much, Ed. Now, lots of questions. I'm going to group a few. We've had quite a few questions which are asking around England, UK. We had the touch on the OECD. So let's see whether we can unpack this one a little bit. Paul or Sophie, I wonder who would like to just explain how we see this working.
I'm happy to pick that up, Richard. Yeah. So yes, this project is funded by Research England, part of UKRI, and so it is an England-only project, but it is nested within the Civic University Network, which is a UK-wide network to support every university and partners of universities who care about the civic agenda. So we're working really hard to ensure that we open up what's being learnt through the Civic Impact Accelerator through the Civic University Network and maintain that connectedness. But of course, because the funding is England only, we also have to be quite careful to respect that as well. So, you know, we're delighted that we've got the partnership with the Civic University Network, which means we can be as open as possible.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess the thing really to reinforce is we do not want this just to be a something that it learns from and engages on an England only basis. We really want this to be open and engaging. So for those of you who are joining from other parts of the UK or indeed internationally, you know, we want this to be engaging and relevant and interesting for you as well. So please do, you know, let's talk more about exactly how best we can make that work. Right, I'm going to pick up a few more questions. So we've had a question. Any thoughts? Specific policy question. Any thoughts around investment zones? The recent investment zone announcement and potential opportunities there. And there's also a question a bit further down around any particular policy areas that we see, you know, we see as early areas for engagement or influence. Who would, Emily,
I'm happy to take that. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think one of the issues that we will be looking at across the programme is the issue of scale. We know that there are some universities working on a hyper-local basis. There are some universities, you know, that are working, you know, at a kind of borough level. You know, and people are forming their civic agreements at, you know, city, borough, region. You know, we've seen all sorts, and so I think the investment zones in that regard also present us with, you know, other spatial geographies that we need to grapple with, basically. And in our initial review of the evidence, which is going to be rapid, you know, we will be looking at where there are examples of good and bad practice of what does and doesn't work, you know, across those different zones, as well as across, you know, the more traditional kind of different layers of geography, basically, because we know that even within one university, people can be operating a civic strategy that is working at various different levels, basically, and we wouldn't be, you know, doing justice to the way people are actually working in the real world if we didn't. So we will be looking, you know, critically at that. I think the same goes for innovation districts. I think it's very important that we look at the evidence around what does and doesn't work in terms of universities' role in innovation districts. And I think in response to the policy areas, I mean, naturally, and you know, we are all probably a little bit weary of this term, you know, there's a very strong conversation with levelling up in terms of you know, the role of civic universities. You know, we know that universities can contribute good and bad to levelling up objectives, and we want to be able to make sure that all of the evidence is, you know, addressing, I suppose, that key policy area. I think another one that's absolutely critical, and it's one of the key domains, is net zero, and the UK's progression towards net zero. And, you know, that's in the environment domain of the civic impact framework. It's also something that we know lots of universities are grappling with internally, but also externally. You know, what's the role of the university in supporting a place to transition to net zero in a way that's inclusive and reflects, you know, a just transition. And we know there are parts of the UK which have stronger evidence than England in this regard. You know, Scotland has declared a just transition framework, and some of the evidence of what universities are doing there is stronger than some of the evidence, you know, in England. And so we want to bring that into dialogue, and all of that is, you know, thinking productively about, you know, how can we improve everybody's practice and give people access to, you know, the best evidence around what works. I should mention that Workstrand 3 has a policy dimension, so we will be looking not only at university policy, but also, you know, at these key thematic areas of policy. And I could go on. I mean, I think the skills agenda always comes up incredibly strongly, and I think, you know, the integrated care system and the development of, you know, a very, very different ecosystem around health and well-being in the UK. I think those are two others that I'd really like to draw out, you know, in terms of where I think the NCIA's, you know, evidence, but also learning will really kind of grapple with in its initial kind of 12 to 18 months.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emily. Okay, I'm going to come on to a question from Alexa Rupertsberg. I think this is probably a Paul or Sophie one, which is what's your difference between civic and community engagement?
Paul,
Sophie, you probably can't resist that one.
Well, we did think about this a lot in the early days of the Civic University Network, and we did actually publish a discussion document called Civic Recipes, where we looked at what different universities are doing and how they are describing their civic work. And we categorized civic as really encompassing all areas of a university's activity. So community engagement would be part of the repertoire of ways in which a university can be civic, but it would also include for instance, very important corporate decisions around, for instance, procurement, around how it uses its sort of economic power. It would also potentially very much be linked to its knowledge building practices and its academic practice. So it is a concept, I think, that animates potentially all areas of a university's activity. So that's how we chose to answer it. And I'll pop a link to the Civic Recipes into chat in a second.
Right. Thank you very much, Paul. Let me go on to, I'll go on to the question just below that one, actually, from Emily Crompton. How grassroots will we go? I think probably, Emily, you've touched on this a little bit, but do you want to just perhaps just expand a bit on that, and obviously others jump in as well if helpful?
Absolutely. I mean, we work at the Institute for Community Studies. We work very directly with the grassroots, and we recognise that increasingly, universities are working with, particularly inspired by the legacy of the pandemic, working with a lot of different, we like to say, constellations of communities. Some of them are mutual aid networks. There's very different forms of community organisation appearing in different places and wanting to engage with the university. I think from the evidence programme's perspective, we will be finding ways to draw on that evidence and to, cluster it, to look at it, and to, respect it as just as important a source of evidence as, larger evaluations of civic partnerships or programmes, or, that kind of larger sort of scale of published work, basically. But it is also fair to say, to manage expectations, we are only one kind of hub team. We will have to be quite specific and targeted and demand-led in terms of what is the what are the key questions that a lot of different universities are grappling with, and how can we best address those. I think it would be foolish for us to promise to be able to engage with all dimensions of every part of England, basically. So I think it's also going to that tools point in Workstrand 3. We very much see ourselves as also equipping and doing capacity building around, universities working with the grassroots more directly. It would be wrong for us to kind of, bypass those local relationships. Our role is really to give people, tools and resources and, a capacity building structure that can mean that people can do more work, with grassroots communities in ethical and inclusive ways, rather than for us to do the work directly, if that makes sense. And, hopefully that is going to provide more of a legacy as well, because we're seeking to shift and continue to strengthen the practice of the civic sector in terms of doing this work well.
Thanks, Sophie. Did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to say just specifically about Workstream 2 and what those action teams might be made up of, who that might be made up of. And somebody also asked a question about, well, is it just for senior leaders, or is it about staff across the organisation? Is it the external partners? And I wondered if the grassroots question was also, is it grassroots community partners, or what kinds of partners? And I think what I'd say is that each institution who might be in wanting to nominate a team to come and work will have a different civic footprint, will have a different focal point for their civic work. And it might be that you're doing a very grassroots kind of community-led approach to your civic work, in which case absolutely it would be involving those grassroots community partners. Whereas if you're doing a different kind of approach, it might be different kinds of partners. So I think from our point of view, we welcome into the process staff at all levels and partners at all levels, if it makes sense from your institutions and your kind of civic engagement approach. you will need to have some kind of senior sponsorship of this, and we'd love to get a few of your senior leaders really actively involved in the learning, in that we absolutely recognise that to affect change, you need to affect change at all levels. But we want to encourage you to really think hard about who would be best involved in that process from your point of view, in terms of mobilising the change that you care about within your location.
Thank you. I'm going to go on to a question which I think was directed towards you, Greg. It was around how would we build support for and capacity at a local level? How will the NCIA? Sorry, it slipped down my screen. How will the NCIA build capacity within users in the community? So thinking about the demand side rather than just viewing this from a university lens.
And I think it links very much to some of the stuff that Emily was just talking about, really. And there's some quite interesting examples of universities starting to work with Citizens UK, which I know Emily's been involved with. So I think it is partly around recognising those different organisations, those different agencies that we can link up with and learn from. So I think there's some quite interesting experience developing across the sector, where universities are doing this with other agencies, with other organisations, and really benefiting from that. So I think it is about, identifying what works, what are the really good examples, and then capturing those in such a way that we can disseminate them, that we can share them with others. So I think what happens too often at the moment is individual institutions might have some really good things that they're doing, but that's not necessarily shared more widely across the sector. So I think one of the real opportunities for the NCIA is to capture those things that work and to disseminate those more widely so that others can benefit from those really good examples of good practice at the local level.
Thanks very much. We've had a couple of areas we haven't touched on very much so far. I'm going to go next to the question about students and where are students in all of this. So it's a question at 310. Will student civic activity feature in the research? Who wants to pick up that one?
I'm happy to start. I'm sure Ed.
We'll have to have a few perspectives on this one. Emily, why don't you start? And then I had Ed and Greg as well.
Yes, so students are, I think they're a crucial part of the civic ecosystem. I think, if, for example, we were addressing a question under the wellbeing dimension around mental health, we know that a lot of practice within universities is about looking at both internal, sort of considerations of how do you affect mental health, but also a lot of universities are doing pioneering partnership work, with that will benefit young people not at the university, and pairing students and other young people locally. So, we would be looking at student-led approaches within addressing that kind of question and building that evidence base. We'd also be looking at approaches that maybe are formed out of different types of civic partnership, that work at different ends of that spectrum. So I think very inclusively, is the answer to that. I don't know if colleagues want to add to that.
Yeah. I was just going to say that it builds really on Paul's point about civic being a very broad church rather than a very small subsection of what a university does. And obviously for many of us, students are a huge part of what we do, where we put our energy. So if we are not thinking about how students impact on our place, we're really missing a massive opportunity of the potential of both what students can contribute, but also how students can really benefit from being part of the civic space. So yeah, absolutely, that whole student space is very much a space of interest in capturing what works, what's the good practices happening, but also how can we really make that work much more effectively than it does. I think at the moment, Emily's absolutely right, what we see are some really quite small scale. It often is coming from an academic department where we had a webinar actually through the CUN only the other week where a few universities were talking about their experience, but actually it was very small scale, really effective, but actually, it was one department, one academic who'd really taken the initiative and made this thing happen. But we haven't seen yet really good examples of where it's embedded in a whole university. And I think that would be obviously the prize, that would be the thing to achieve, really, where we get it at scale and it's really having a big impact across the place.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks very much. There's a few questions which are around how do we join up across the sector on this? How do we connect with different networks that are already there? How do people connect in? We've got a couple of specific networks referenced in the questions. I wonder, Greg, do you just want to pick up that one? How do we make those connections work? What do people need to do, or what do we need to do to connect up?
Yes, so I think Emily mentioned that in workstream 3, one of the elements is the sort of policy landscape space, and within one of the posts within workstream 3, they will be actually building the relationships with other networks. So starting by mapping out who are those potential networks that we might link with. And that's already started really. So trying to identify where are there opportunities, where are the connections that we need to make. So that will be a key part of a role within workstream 3.
Okay, good. We've got time probably for 2 or 3 more questions. So I'm just going to again pick out 1 or 2 in areas that we haven't touched on so much so far. There's a question which I think I'm probably going to point at you first, Ed, which is the aim of impact evidence. It sounds a bit close to the aims of the REF and the KEF. So is this the CEF, if I can call it that?
I saw that question and I was trying to work out how many more letters of the alphabet. We could have probably another 22 excellence frameworks if we really wanted. But we don't want that, I think. I think one of the critical differences between the civic impact framework, as we're using as a sort of guiding set of principles for our work on the NCIA, and the kind of underlying rubric of the REF and the KEF and the TEF, is that we, and this is going to sound like a very strange thing to say, this is not about measuring excellence. I think it's about looking for good practice and excellent practice in particular contexts. It's much more context specific. And as I mentioned in answer to a previous question, it's much more about seeing impact and success in the context of what's been agreed locally with partners. And I think that's a different philosophy to the KEF, the REF, and all of the other EFs that you can imagine. Not me, because that was my initials, but I don't know if that answers the question, but I think when I sort of offered a few words in response to Emily's description, workstream 1, I said what works isn't quite so interesting as what works for whom, in what context, and how. And that's really what it's about, really. So when we're thinking about impact, it's not just about quantification or excellence using the sort of REF kind of language. It's really about understanding the context specific.
Good. Okay, I'm going to again come to a question we've not talked very directly about so far, and this is where is central government in all of this? And it's a question. It's 323 in the Q&A box. So Civic University Commission was critical of the lack of support that central government has given to the civic role of universities, and let's be honest, we've seen mixed messages over the last few years since the Civic University Commission. What do we hope that ultimately the NCIA's work will help get this more clearly into government thinking and onto the government radar? And what might that look like?
Shall I take this?
Greg, do you want to start on that one? I see a few hands twitching on that one, but you start.
I think this is interesting in a way, because when we started the CUN, we were really keen to get government departments involved, and we spent a lot of energy trying to work with different government departments, engage with them, and were pretty unsuccessful, if I'm honest, in getting anyone very interested. I think the flip side is, and I suppose this goes back a bit to what Ed was just saying, that because we are not being driven by government targets or government measurement in this space, it does enable us as a sector to define what we mean by civic and to set the agenda. And I think there is, I don't think we should underestimate the positiveness of that, because it does mean that universities can do things driven by local need and not being driven by central government targets. And I think the danger of a government department picking up civic and defining it would be, we would end up with some sort of framework which would actually push people in a very centralized way, which again, picking up Ed's link, may not be completely relevant to the context and the place that people are operating. So I think I'm a lot more, I think I can see much more now the positives of government not being so interested than perhaps when I started 3 years ago thinking this was a problem. So I think we've worked with it and it actually gives us opportunities as well as difficulties. So I'm much less, I spend less of my time worrying about it than I did 3 years ago.
Let me just throw in and link this up with another question which I've seen earlier, which is the recent interest in the devolution agenda being focused on mayoral authorities. Does that risk giving us too much of a city region focus at the expense of perhaps a more local perspective? Emily, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, certainly. How to put this? I mean, I think it would be unfair to say that the recent focus on devolution deals, when you get down to, you know, sort of how, for example, the recent one, you know, for the north of Tyne, for example, when you get down to that level of where they're actually going to be working, yes, it is, you know, focused on mayoral and combined authorities, but, you know, underneath each of those devolution deals, there's a myriad of hyper-local partnership and, you know, sort of hyper-local programme working, thinking about, you know, what community engagement structures look like, you know, sort of that reach down into, you know, all of the different areas that sit both, you know, within, but also, you know, adjacent to, you know, sort of each of those deals. So I think it does definitely, you know, give weight to the power being focused on city, you know, regions, and I think we wouldn't want that to then flow into how we, you know, balance our focus across the NCIA. I think we want to pay equal weight to, you know, small scale areas, you know, to rural areas that perhaps wouldn't get this level of powers. We also want to pay, you know, sort of sufficient interest into what's happening in places that, you know, wouldn't necessarily be able to attract that kind of devolution deal, you know, and I think we don't want to, I suppose we wouldn't be directing the focus of the NCIA programme to speak more to those areas than, you know, to others. But I think it also presents, I was going to add to, you know, the previous question, one of the things we get asked a huge amount at the Institute for Community Studies is really around what do good partnerships look like, and good, you know, effectively a lot of those are good civic partnerships. They will be through a particular lens, you know, whether that's about inclusive growth, what does a really good partnership that's between multi sectors within a place look like to deliver inclusive growth. And a lot of that is coming out of, you know, the myriad of funds, the shared prosperity fund, you know, the community ownership fund, the towns fund, now these devolution deals. You know, people are having to grapple with a huge amount of money, resources, you know, new powers and new accountabilities that are going into place at the moment. Now, the role of the NCIA in that, I think, is to demonstrate and also to continually provoke the question of what does really good partnership look like, and some of that needs to flow back up to national government, because, you know, we see tenders come out that do not have strong enough, you know, don't, for example, offer a strong enough weight to, you know, university or other anchor institution actors, you know, to play a role, basically. So we need to be having these conversations at the very practical doing end, I think, as well as at the kind of policy advocacy end, which is more about demonstrating what really, really good work looks like and hoping that that then drives more resource and investment into place.
Good, thank you. We are drawing towards the end. I should just say, and we'll just note this again right at the end, but we will be sending out a survey to everyone who's registered for this session over the next couple of days, which will be asking you to express interest in different ways to get involved, different ways to connect. So I can see lots of the comments and questions are around connections with particular interest groups, some specific questions about could we engage as an individual institution, groups of institutions. So we'll be sending that survey round, and please do look out for that and come back on it, and we'll follow up on, obviously, on all the responses. I'm going to just, I'll pick, I think let's see whether this may be the last question, because it might take a might be one or two people want to jump in on this one, but are we focusing? It's a question at 3:36. Are we focusing too much on our impact, i.e., the impact of higher education institutions, and are we connected enough with what our constituencies think? I think we've touched on this in a few ways, but it's a good sharp one to finish on. So let's just come back on that one. I wonder who would like to come in on that. I wonder, there's a little bit here around the assessment framework. So perhaps shall I start with you, Ed, and then I'm sure others might want to come in as well.
It's an excellent question and an excellent challenge, and I guess we're all guilty, particularly those of us who work in universities, and that's not all of us on this call by any means, but those of us who probably do follow the fashion of universities referring to themselves as our, all the time, our research, our impact, and I think that's a fair challenge. We do need to be concerned about what our constituencies think. I think on the call today, we have heard a number of examples of that. Yeah, I'd like to make the connection because there's not been enough time to answer all of these questions, but there was another excellent question, a sort of related question, which would be, for example, should universities be thinking about how they listen to their own residents and communities as to where they do research on what topics? And I'm not going to answer that, but it's an excellent related challenge. And I think these are just exactly the sorts of things that we need to grapple with in the NCIA.
Good. Paul, did you come? Oh, sorry, Paul and Emily, and then
Paul, go first. Sure. I've spoken a lot.
I don't particularly like the title, the National Civic Impact Accelerator, to be brutally honest. I think that we're a learning accelerator. Although we've used that term, we need to be really mindful of the consequences and the impact of the work that we do. But I think for all of us on the team, we're much more interested in listening and learning about how to do this work well. And I think that's why Sophie and I feel so committed to being part of the NCIA, because we love this work. We love worrying about how to do it as well as possible, and we do not for a minute assume that it is a impact kind of job to just fix the world. So let's learn together, and we would love you to be part of this with us. So please do stay in touch would be my plea, and let's have some really interesting times together.
Thank you, Paul. Emily.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't think that you can look properly or robustly at what works here, in other words, what would work in particular different places, as Ed said, under particular conditions, in civic working, which is all about partnership between different actors in a place, without looking equally at, what is the impact of the other anchor institutions in that place and community-led networks, and in also looking critically at the role of how politics intercedes in that. So the way that we are thinking about the evidence programme, of course we are here to be the body that looks critically at universities' practice, but we wouldn't be able to do that well, and we wouldn't be able to, as Paul said, learn sort of humbly and generously from that without looking at the absolutely integral role that other types of organisation and institution play in that place. Where there is, I wouldn't want to jump forward to what the evidence base will say, but, we see more examples of bad civic practice where it is just about the university's single role, basically. We see lots of examples of how universities can negatively impact on place when we're not really thinking critically about that interrelationship and interdependency with the wider ecosystem of anchor institutions and the community sector. So we're going to be bringing that focus to all of the work of the NCIA so that it doesn't become too navel-gazy, and so it can also give generously to the role and profile of other institutions that are doing really fantastic work in local areas.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you, everyone. I'm going to draw us to a close at that point. Can I just say thanks for all the really excellent questions and comments which people have put in the chat and the Q&A. If we haven't directly answered your question, my apologies for that. I hope we've covered the main themes that have come up, and we will pick up any particular ones that we haven't addressed directly. So can I also say thank you very much to our presenters and our panelists. I think you've given us a really good introduction to the NCIA, to the work streams, and to what happens next. As everyone has said as we've gone through, this is not about the team who are leading the work streams and the team who are most directly involved. It's about all of us coming together and learning from each other. So I would just really reinforce that. As I said a few minutes ago, we will be sending you all a survey over the next few days, inviting your engagement and inviting your further comments. And as Sophie went through in her segment of the introduction, we're also looking for people to join the learning groups, and expressions of interest will be invited over the next few weeks or so. Many thanks to all of you. We really look forward to working together on this and working on what I think is going to be a really exciting next phase of our work in this area. Thank you.